third stage completely pressurized. 40 seconds away from the Apollo 11 liftoff. All the second stage tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Neil Armstrong reported back when he received the good wishes. Thank you very much. We know it will be a good flight. Good luck and Godspeed. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5.
Whether you're navigating a rocket to the moon or making a simple journey by train, there's little in our lives today that doesn't depend on one factor, the coordination of time. The clocks of the world are synchronized through one single reference point, the Greenwich Meridian. The decision to adopt Greenwich as the prime meridian was made just 100 years ago. Among the centenary celebrations, the British Post Office issued a set of commemorative stamps designed by Howard Waller.
Like most people, I suppose, I'd never given the Greenwich Meridian much thought until the stamp project. I vaguely knew about GMT and the pips on the radio and changing your watch when you go abroad, but I just accepted it all and never thought about what it all meant. In fact, the Meridian and its establishment is like a detective story lasting thousands of years, with new clues being discovered and new bits of the puzzle falling into place. Then it all came together with the 1884 conference.
In that year, representatives from 25 nations met in Washington, D.C. for the purpose of fixing upon a meridian proper to be employed as a common zero of longitude and standard of time reckoning throughout the world. It was agreed to adopt the meridian passing through the centre of the transit instrument at Greenwich Royal Observatory in London, England. This decision led to the acceptance of Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT, as the basis of the world time zone system. That transit instrument mentioned at the Washington conference was the Airy Transit Circle, a specialized telescope for measuring the movements of the heavenly bodies. It was designed and installed in 1850 by the 7th Astronomer Royal, Sir George Biddle Airy. No matter where in the world observations are made, the prime meridian, 0 degrees of longitude, is still defined by the Airy Transit Circle at Greenwich. On one side, the eastern hemisphere, on the other, the west. To make any kind of measurement, you need a starting point, a zero. A meridian is simply an imaginary line from North Pole to South Pole which provides this starting point, the 0 of longitude from which east-west measurements can be made. The movements of the Earth are complex. It spins on its axis, revolves in an elliptical orbit around the Sun, and our entire solar system is hurtling through space. For anyone standing on the surface of the Earth, the Sun, the Moon, and the stars move across the sky in a regular cycle. This movement of the heavenly bodies, measured against a fixed point, such as the imaginary line of the meridian, is used as a giant celestial clock. The Airy Transit Circle is mounted so that it will scan precisely along the meridian. When looking through the telescope, the observer can track the movement of a star. 4 timings are made and used to record the exact moment at which the star crosses the meridian. 600,000 observations made during the 100 years' work with Airy's telescope kept the great clocks at Greenwich in time with the turning of the Earth. The story of how the Greenwich Meridian came to be adopted by the world as zero longitude begins in the Middle Ages, with the problems of navigating ships across the great oceans. In the 15th century, knowledge of the geography of the world was still fairly rudimentary. Maps and charts of the period reveal a lamentable lack of accuracy in their details of coastline, and in particular in their measurement of east-west distances. Even with instruments as crude as the cross-staff, surveyors could judge north-south distances or latitude with a fair degree of accuracy. But east-west measurement or longitude was an entirely different matter. For the sailors of the day, this wasn't too great a problem so long as they stuck to coastal navigation. But with the advent of the great voyages of discovery to the east and west, it was to prove a serious and often disastrous drawback. The journeys of Christopher Columbus across the Atlantic were all the more remarkable because he could not find longitude accurately and so could not pinpoint his east-west position. His maps were later to be proved grossly incorrect. Magellan, on the first circumnavigation of the world, along with many of his ships and men, never survived the journey. But those who did return were astonished to discover that they had somehow gained a day in their lives. It had long been known, in theory, that longitude and time were inextricably linked. When it's midday on one side of the world, it's midnight on the other. The Earth takes 24 hours to make one complete revolution. Looking down on the Earth from a point directly above the North Pole, you have a circle. Divide the 360 degrees of this circle by 24 hours, and you arrive at the equation 1 hour of time equals 15 degrees of longitude. For instance, if the navigator of a ship in the Atlantic knew his time was 11 a.m. and had some way of knowing that it was 12 noon at Greenwich, then he would be able to calculate his longitude as 15 degrees west of Greenwich. All very well in theory, but navigators simply did not have reliable clocks or other means to make accurate calculations, nor did they have the essential detailed knowledge of the movement of the planets and stars to aid them. There arose a great rivalry between the European maritime powers. The first to discover the secret of finding longitude would have a great advantage in the race to take command of the high seas. Holland, Spain, and France all offered tantalizing financial prizes to anyone who could come up with a solution. Navigational schools flourished, and the greatest scientific minds turned their knowledge and imagination to solving the riddle. Of one thing there was no doubt. An increased knowledge of the movement of the heavenly bodies was a vital element. Some even thought that astronomy could provide a complete answer. In France, Louis XIV established the Paris Observatory. Using the meridian, which passes through the observatory, as the zero of longitude, the coastline of France was remapped, showing how grossly inaccurate previous maps had been. Louis, displeased by the apparent reduction of his domain, remarked that his surveyors had lost him more territory than his armies had gained. England, as an island nation, was desperately aware of the importance that sea power would play in the years to come. Charles II was convinced of the need to establish his own observatory. In 1665, he signed a royal warrant, appointing John Flamsteed as his astronomical observer, to help solve the problem of finding longitude at sea. On the advice of Sir Christopher Wren, who was to design the buildings, Flamsteed chose Greenwich Hill as the site of the Royal Observatory. He was soon able to set up his instruments in the great room and begin observations. These would occupy him and his assistants for the next 50 years. The results of these labours were a meticulously detailed atlas of the stars and a catalogue showing their positions and movements. Flamsteed's work was an important stage in solving the longitude problem, but the final answer was still a long way off. In September 1707, there was a major naval disaster. Sir Cloudesley's shovel, with 21 ships of the Royal Navy, struck the Gilstone ledges off the Scilly Isles. 3 ships were lost, and of the 1,200 men on board, only 1 was saved. This calamity, the latest in a series of tragic navigational errors, aroused great public indignation. The government responded by setting up the Board of Longitude and offering a reward of £20,000, £1 million today, to whoever could find longitude at sea. Naturally, such a handsome reward prompted a flood of schemes and propositions. One such proposed that vessels would be moored at regular intervals along the trade routes. At midnight, they would all fire rockets into the air to burst at 6,440 feet precisely, so that voyaging ships could get their bearings. The light vessels were to be moored by sea anchors, fixed to the allegedly immovable layers of water beneath. This and even more fantastic schemes were a source of great amusement for the wits of the time, who had a field day satirizing the crazy people attempting to find position at sea. Finding the longitude, like squaring the circle, passed into everyday language to denote something that was, to all intents and purposes, impossible. Meanwhile, work continued at the Royal Observatory. After nearly 100 years of observation, the astronomers had collected sufficient information to publish the Nautical Almanac. Its tables predicted the position of the moon and the stars on a day-to-day basis. This was the first truly practical method of solving the longitude problem. The Nautical Almanac was published annually and eagerly taken up as a navigational aid by the majority of the world's shipping. Since the almanac was based on the Greenwich Meridian, from this time on, most navigational charts were also based on Greenwich.
We've got 0 degrees here.
To make use of the almanac, navigators still needed an accurate observational instrument. The simple cross-staff had evolved through a series of more and more complex designs until, finally, by the mid-18th century, it produced the sextant. The sextant, together with the almanac, gave the navigator everything he needed to find longitude at sea, but the calculations were extremely complex. A better solution would be to carry Greenwich time on board ship. Indeed, it was John Harrison, a clockmaker, who finally claimed the £20,000 prize. Harrison was the first person to design a clock both accurate and robust enough to withstand the rigours of a long ocean voyage. His first marine chronometer, known as the H1, was given a sea trial aboard the warship Centurion. It was a large, heavy machine, but it was designed with miraculous precision and incorporated several ingenious new features. Because the pendulum would not work at sea, Harrison replaced it with a pair of balances, pivoted at their centres. The gridiron used alternate brass and steel rods to control the mechanism, so that the beat of the clock remained the same, however extreme the changes in temperature. He continued to improve and to refine the mechanism through successive models, the H2 and the H3. Eventually, he was able to miniaturize the whole clock and produce the famous H4, the first accurate and reliable marine watch. A copy of Harrison's watch by Larkham Kendall, known as K1, accompanied Captain Cook, along with the Nautical Almanac, on his second great voyage of discovery. Of the watch, tested over 3 years of voyaging, both in the Antarctic and the tropics, Cook wrote, "Being now and then corrected by lunar observations, it has been our faithful guide through all the vicissitudes of climates." A standard time, which for most navigators meant Greenwich time, could now be carried on board ship. The longitude problem was solved at last. The sighting of the Royal Observatory on Greenwich Hill overlooking the River Thames now turned out to be especially appropriate, because ships using the Port of London could zero their watches to Greenwich time as they set out on their voyages. A time ball was erected on the eastern turret to provide the world's first regular time signal. Every day the ball is still hoisted halfway up the pole at 12:55 and right up to the top at 12:58. It's released at 1 o'clock precisely. Whilst Greenwich time was important to the astronomers and navigators, the communities at large kept their own local time, based on the rising and setting of the sun. When the clocks at Greenwich were striking midday, it would still be 11:54 in Southampton, and only 11:48 in Taunton. For the citizens of Plymouth, lying 4 degrees to the west of Greenwich, midday would fall a whole 16 minutes later. This was far from convenient for His Majesty's mail coaches, which by the 1780s were trying to establish regular scheduled timetables. To overcome the problem, the guard carried a special timepiece, which by the operation of a lever in the back could be regulated to gain time when travelling eastwards and to lose time when travelling westwards. When travellers were few and the rate of travel slow, few people were concerned with the anomalies of local time. But after 1825, with the coming of the railways and the steady increase in travel and communication, common sense dictated the need to establish a standard time throughout the country. A new and popular subject of public debate became the argument over local time versus railway time. And it was not just the railways pressing for standardization. It was proposed to Rowland Hill, instigator of the penny postal system, that all post office clocks throughout the country should be kept to Greenwich time. The ideal man to organize the standardization of time was close at hand, in the person of George Biddle Airy, the 7th Astronomer Royal. He took advantage of the opening of the London-Greenwich Railway in 1836 to begin the first civic time service. An assistant from the observatory began a weekly call on the principal clockmakers of London, taking with him a pocket watch set to Greenwich time. This service was continued by the assistant's daughter, Ruth Belville, right up until 1930. The Greenwich time lady, as she became known, would make up to 50 calls a week with her Arnold chronometer, checked daily against the public clock outside Greenwich Observatory. Another development was soon to revolutionize the distribution of time. The discovery of how to harness electricity, which led to the invention of the telegraph. Airy was quick to take advantage of this. He ordered a special electric clock, which would automatically send time signals down the telegraph line. Gradually, Greenwich time was made available through the post office, the railways, and the telegraph companies. By 1855, nearly every public clock in Britain was set to Greenwich time. Some 10 years later, the Great Eastern laid the first transatlantic cable. The Greenwich time signal was received twice daily through the cable, enabling longitude to be found with precise accuracy. When the Great Eastern reached Heart's Content in Newfoundland, Greenwich time could be received on the continent of North America. With 3,000 miles of land from east to west, the continued use of local time was giving the citizens of the USA an enormous headache. Traveling from New York to California, a passenger would have to alter his watch some 20 times during the journey. At a major station, he might find himself confronted with a battery of clocks, giving as many as 7 versions of the correct time. To solve this problem, a scheme was devised dividing the country into 5 zones, with a time difference of 1 hour between each zone. The scheme was based on Greenwich Mean Time and was adopted in 1883. The following year, the International Meridian Conference met in Washington, D.C. Of all the initial meridians then in use, Greenwich had the greatest claim to being selected as the world's prime meridian. 72% of the world's shipping tonnage was already using charts based on Greenwich, and the USA had adopted a time zone system based on an hourly adjustment of Greenwich time. By an overwhelming majority, the Greenwich Meridian was chosen to represent 0 degrees longitude. For the man in the street, the result of the Washington Conference was the gradual acceptance of Greenwich Mean Time as a standard from which to set the clocks of the world. The coming of the radio eased the distribution of Greenwich time, and in 1924, the BBC began broadcasting its 6-pip time signal. This signal still originates from the Royal Observatory, now moved to Herstmonceux in Sussex. The time today is taken from an average of several cesium atomic clocks. These are coordinated with some 80 other atomic clocks from 24 countries, which together make a world mean clock. This international mean clock is accurate to within 1 second in 10,000 years. Observations of the celestial clock are made automatically by the photographic zenith tube. In principle, it's a direct development of the transit circle designed by Airy, but it measures time more accurately and saves much laborious work for the observer. The observatory at Greenwich is now a museum, and the telescope no longer used. But the Airy transit circle still defines the prime meridian of the world. When those 18th century wits made fun of the crazy people engaged in the impossible task of finding longitude, little did they realize that the solution to this age-old problem would one day play a part in mankind's exploration of space.
We see it at our left-hand window. It's a little more than a half Earth. We're looking at the eastern Pacific Ocean a long way south of the equator, probably 45 degrees.